All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. It's great to be back. This is the third annual Georgie Danis seminar on security and diplomacy in Eastern Mediterranean. This is an effort that I started 3 years ago due to the pandemic, actually the summer of 2020, in lieu of a program that we usually do in Greece. We didn't want to lose the momentum, so we sort of like flipped and took advantage of Zoom technology and brought academics from across the region and here in the United States to really discuss the Eastern Mediterranean as an area, not necessarily forgotten area, but an area where politics is vibrant and and culture and all the dilemmas facing the world today are also very alive there. That was a very, very successful week-long program that then we duplicated in January of 2021. And here we are 3 years later, or 2 years later, hosting the third annual event with the help of, thank you, of Mr. George Danis and the Karamanlis chair at the Fletcher School, who is also a partner and partners in Greece as well. The Institute of International Relations in Greece and the American College of Greece and the Institute of Global Affairs there as well. So we have a distinct pleasure of bringing together a number of academics, policy makers, and experts from the region. And this is actually, a lot more easier than people might imagine, bringing everybody together, because it's been sort of like an open hand and really a very welcoming recipients on the other end in discussing this. And in this year's theme throughout the week is the idea of resurgent nationalism, and we put the resurgent in quotations, if you wish. Whether it's something that's has been it's coming back or it's always been there. And I think that's something that we'll discuss throughout this week. It's with a great pleasure that actually, have somebody that I admire very much, his work and what he's published over the years, and followed his career, a young academic, fairly young, I would say. But you wouldn't be able to tell by his accomplishments, which are many and varied. Speaking about our keynote speaker this morning, Dr. Haris Milonas, who is Associate Professor of Political Science and International Affairs. His work contributes to our understandings of states' management of diversity that may originate from national minorities and immigrants, diasporas or refugees. He's particularly interested in the role of decision makers, perceptions about foreign involvement in domestic affairs, and the impact these perceptions have on the planning and implementation of state policies. He's teaching undergraduate courses on nationalism, patriotism, European integration, and graduate courses on nation building, nationalism, and qualitative research of methods. Professor Milonas has written widely. He has an award-winning book that was published in 2012, The Politics of Nation Building, Making Co-National Refugees and Minorities, which is at Cambridge University Press. He's also working on a number of other projects, and he has two co-edited volumes, Enemies Within, Fifth Column Politics in Comparative Perspective, which is an Oxford University Press, a new publication 2022, and the Micro Foundations of Diaspora Politics, also Routledge Press of 2022. He's also, since 2018, he has been the editor-in-chief of Nationalities Papers, a peer-reviewed journal, widely recognized and very formidable journal with the University Press for the Association for the Study of Nationalities. He has been serving as a member of the board of directors at the ASN since 2011. He's a member of the editorial board of Diaspora Studies, as well as the Journal of Modern Greek Studies from 2019 to 2021. Professor Milonas has received his PhD in political science from Yale University. his master's at University of Chicago and has completed his undergraduate studies at the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at the University of Athens, Greece. And in 2008, 2009, and 2011, 2012 academic years, he was an academy scholar at the Harvard Academy for International and Area Studies. And this is just a partial of Professor Milonas's bio. So without further ado, I just want to welcome you, and what a great start to our discussion this week.
Thank you so much, Petro, for these kind words. I almost felt tired from what you were reading, like physically tired. Thankfully, all this happened in a long time. The talk for today is going to focus, as Petros announced, and I want to thank him and all of the people who are working for this event today for their collaboration and help with putting together this event. So today I'm going to start by sharing some of my views, both on the title, but more importantly on the theme of nationalism and resurgent nationalism. It would help me if people decide to turn on their cameras, but if you don't feel comfortable, that's fine. But definitely at the Q&A, obviously, it would really help. But for now, I'm going to share my screen so that we can basically get a better sense of what I'm trying to present. So, as I said, I'm going to present on the topic of resurgent nationalism. But first, I want to invite you all to think about, especially those of you who are born in the early 2000s or late 1990s, who may be among the audience if you're students. Think about whether this is actually something that is resurgent, meaning that it wasn't constantly there, right? Or so resurgent implies that in some way there was a lull, and then there is a storm of some sort. But again, as one of my, I guess you could call them affiliations or roles in life, is, as Petro suggested, being an editor-in-chief, of Nationalities papers. So these are some recent covers from the journal that I'm an editor-in-chief for. And we published it with Cambridge University Press. And as you can see here, nationalism has been around for a while. But on top of that, the journal has been around for over 50 years. So in a way, you could say that it hasn't really been out of our minds, or it has been constantly important. People have associated, of course, nationalism in the 20th century with 2 world wars and the terrible, tragic repercussions it had. Obviously, the Holocaust comes in mind when nationalism is being discussed. But at the same time, people have focused on nationalism from the perspective of most famously decolonization movements, India's independence, a lot of independence movement in Africa, the sub-Saharan Africa especially, but also North Africa. People have associated nationalism with a lot of positive developments, in other words, as well as a lot of tragic events. But regardless of how you see nationalism as a force in international relations, but also domestically, there is no doubt that once somebody gives you a list of the things that nationalism has been intrinsically associated with, there is no doubt, I think, that we start, I guess, putting in quotation marks, as Petro said, the resurgent part to an extent. Now, having said that, I think I never asked the organizers to put the quotation marks around my title, and I kept their title as well, because there are, I think, some ways that we can make an argument that there is something new or resurgent, some resurgent quality in what's going on. And I'm going to try to first unpack what I think may be a little bit different. First of all, one thing we can say with certain certainty, with a degree of certainty, is that while nationalism has been with us for a long time, as I've kind of, I think, demonstrated by throwing at you some of these big events that it has been associated with, at the same time, nationalism is a much more common sense belief at the individual level, at the level of every one of us, than it has ever been in the past. And that's an argument that has been quite, meticulously made by Professor Sinisa Malesevich, who is a professor at the University of Dublin. And he has made a very good case, I think, and that's why I start with this discussion, sociological case, that somehow individuals, for obvious reasons that you will think of yourselves once I, mention them, and you'll find them intuitive, I mean, individuals in the 19th century, where arguably nationalism played an important role in various state building, state formation, nation formation processes, individuals then, on average, were not as exposed to nationalism because, for example, schooling systems were not as developed. Maybe there was compulsory schooling, but the implementation, the enrollment rates, in other words, were quite low, for example. Similarly, the printing press was developing, but it wasn't as strong as it became later. Fast forward to your world, the internet wasn't there, instant communication and distribution of information was not there. So all those things that operated as ways to inculcate nationalism into the heads or hearts of and minds, as we say these days, of individuals were weaker, were less developed, were less potent. So the argument goes, as modernity progressed, as technological innovations happened, we had a much more potent toolkit to make people more nationalist, if you want. In other words, to internalize these ideas that the state officials wanted people to internalize. So as a result, today's, let's say, Serbia is more nationalistic in terms of internalizing these at the individual level than Serbia of the First World War, where obviously nationalism was important, and many people would argue that Serbian nationalism was at the heart of the beginning of World War I. For those of you who are studying international relations or the history of World War I, the First World War, or what was called then the Great War, until the other war happened in 20th century, the Second World War. So although we associate Serbian nationalism with World War I, if you actually were to do some surveys, let's say back then, and compare those surveys with how much more ingrained these ideas are today, you would find that nationalism is much more of a common sense belief today than it was then. The second reason why we can talk about resurgent nationalism without quotation marks is that there is something in my theory in the book that Petros, kindly enough mentioned to you, The Politics of Nation Building. I make a big deal out of this, that I do believe that geopolitics, and more specifically, the structure of the international system, plays a tremendously important role in terms of it accounts for the waxing and waning of how much nationalism we see, at least at the international level, at the international security level. Maybe it doesn't explain domestic politics as much, this geopolitical instability, but it does definitely affect interstate relations quite a lot. So the next so the reason here, the logic here, to unpack it a little bit as I did for the previous one, is that geopolitical instability, as we will see in a minute more elaborately when I present some of my work on this, increases the likelihood that countries will meddle in the internal affairs of their international competitors. And through that, we get a lot more nationalism because of dynamics that are being unleashed at that level, right? So that under this bullet point, we would put things like irredentist nationalism that is being discussed a lot today, of course, with what Putin's Russia is doing vis-a-vis Ukraine and its war in Ukraine, and the discourse that it's actually being used in order to legitimize this campaign by Putin's regime is very much a nationalist, irredentist nationalist discourse. Moving to a third reason, in a way, that I came up in my mind with in order to justify why we talk about resurgent nationalism and not just fully put it as just nationalism, is that we have seen at the domestic level now, because the previous point was about the international security mostly, at the domestic level, we see in electoral politics, at least in democracies and what we could call competitive authoritarian regimes sometimes, as Ziblatt and Levitsky would call it, in those areas, we see often in the past decade or so, if not longer, electoral successes by what have been called populist and ethno-nationalist movements. So a lot of these parties that got elected in various countries that became really infamous, let's say Bolsonaro's movement in Brazil, or the Brexit movement that actually succeeded in getting Britain out of the European Union. A lot of these movements, and many would include, of course, President Trump's movement and victory in that bucket. So again, how these movements don't have to be the same. What the point is here is that many people who used nationalist discourse and in particular used it in a way that people would say narrowed the definition of what it means to be British, Brazilian, or American in those three examples, for example. And we could add here Modi's India, and how he has a much more narrow definition of what it means to be Indian. That narrowing of the definition of the nation, or the boundaries of belonging, as I say in my work, has been electorally successful, and that has been perceived as another sign of a resurgent nationalist trend, rather than just, a continuation of nationalism as it has existed. Now, at the same time, to go back in this empirical duality of nationalism about good and bad, whether it's good or bad, that I know a lot of you are thinking of because of how we think about our life, when we go about our lives, how we think about these things. Just to take the example of Donald Trump, former President Trump, Trump's nationalism, narrow understanding of American identity, let's say, and how he went about being a president of the United States, was countered and defeated in the polls by someone who didn't negate nationalism, right? It was someone like now President Biden, who proposed his own version of nationalism, building back better, instead of make America great again. And more recently, the theme having been the battle for the soul of the nation, tellingly, right? So President Biden's State of the Union address, but also his famous now speech in Philadelphia just before the midterm elections this past November, was clearly a message that we're not giving up American nationalism to the other side. Let's say we're reclaiming nationalism, American nationalism, but we're claiming it with, if you want to put it that way, with more liberal characteristics, without narrowing the definition of what it means to be American, but reinvigorating a more creedal, principle-based understanding of nationalism that is equally nationalism, but it's a very different variety of nationalism. It's a good point to plug a new book I'm writing with Maya Tudor, which should be coming out from Cambridge University Press in the next 4 or 5 months, called Varieties of Nationalism, where we do discuss this empirical duality of nationalism. Finally, actually, penultimately, another thing that you must be painfully familiar with is social media. And the spread and adoption of social media has played a role in a way, justifying this type of title that we have here, because nationalism, and that kind of links to my first point as you see it on your screens right now, in the sense that at the same time that the technological advancements have made people more disciplined, as Michel Foucault would call it, into this understanding of us being subjects of particular nation states, right? Social media is an extreme version of telecommunication, let's say, and communication in general, that instantly transmits both visual and verbal and written communication. And while this can be used for a lot of good, it can also and has been used to spread a lot of misinformation, a lot of stereotypes, a lot of racial hatred and ethnic hatred, and a lot of scapegoating type of material that has stoked a lot of tensions between ethnic groups. It has legitimated a lot of illiberal turns that we talked about earlier. And many times has even led to vigilante attacks, but also led to or give credibility to a wide range of security dilemmas between groups and leaders that were trying to mobilize their own constituencies. And a lot of this work that I'm presenting in these last 2 bullet points dovetails well with my work in my recently published book that Petros mentioned kindly, Enemies Within, the Global Politics of Fifth Columns, that just came out with Oxford University Press, and it's co-edited with Scott Radnitz from University of Washington. If you don't want to read the whole book, we wrote a short piece for Foreign Affairs magazine called, which kind of summarizes the main points of the book, called The Disturbing Return of the Fifth Column, and kind of makes some of these points, especially about how social media, how populist leaders, or what are called populist leaders, because I have my own issues we can discuss about whether these are actually populist or just people who are narrowly defining their nation, how this plays out in today's world, and how social media have played a negative role, in my opinion, in that respect. So I'll stop here for a second and pose to see if there are any questions based on what I've said so far. Because I'm gonna pivot into more theoretical land. But if people fully understood everything, I can continue. But if there is any question in what I've said so far, Petro, feel free to stop.
I don't see any questions. I just like, from my take, I think a lot of the things that we discuss a lot of times have to do with the whole notion of citizenship and democracy. And I know, like, one of the points that Mr. Danis has drives constantly is this whole idea of citizenship and engagement. And it seems to me that this framing of nationalism that you just gave us is sort of driven a lot of times by our continuous focus on individualism and taking away from group identity, so that group identity sort of like creates like this positive and negative associations, and nationalism seems to be like subconsciously has become like this negative associational structure, and all of a sudden we're missing that glue, and it seems like that nationalism might be one of those gluing agents, if you wish, towards citizenship as well, you know. So just
Yeah.
like just as a comment in listening to you for the first part of your discussion point.
Yeah, and in a way, I think you're agreeing with the fact that I'm trying to put a stop on this, in the sense that we need to understand that how I usually talk about this, and it's going to be relevant in what I'm about to say, is that if you think, you can think of the history of humanity as broadening the circles of belonging to which we owe solidarity to. And obviously humanity and Homo sapiens, let's not go further back, but Homo sapiens to a great extent started with having solidarity only to their immediate family, maybe to the clan group or king group, and so on and so forth. And in a way, you can see nationalism from that light. You can see nationalism as a positive thing, because it's a force, the way I understand it, it's a force that allowed, or an ideological force, let's say, that allowed people to extend solidarity for the first time at such great lengths, right? And to people they have never met in person. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, I can totally see that certain people would automatically say, well, maybe we're ready now to extend solidarity at the global level, which would be the the cosmopolitan critique to nationalism. And I'm sympathetic to that viewpoint. The question is whether humanity or, you know, our civilization is there yet, or whether individuals are there yet, or whether, as Marx would put it, if he were a cosmopolitan, if our false consciousness of nationalism, is there. No. And that's a question mark. And of course, there is that growing battle, and probably this new generation of people who are listening to us may be closer to that than our generation, Petros. So I see that as an evolution of broader circles of belonging and extending solidarity to broader circles of belonging. Clearly, what we have as the contemporary model is bigger. It's a better model than, let's say, the city-state model, where you would extend solidarity only to your city-state. And the way that is better, just to anticipate someone who would say, well, what about empires? There were also big, you know, groupings of people. Well, yeah, they were big, but there was no idea of solidarity. In fact, they were ruled in such a brutal and non-democratic way that actually we cannot compare them to contemporary, at least democratic nation states, because the assumption here is an assumption of equality, while in empires, there was no assumption of equality. In fact, there was pure understanding of hierarchy, be it caste systems or second-class citizens, and so on and so forth. So that's how the nation state is superior, not just because it broadens solidarity, but also more, at least in the democratic variety of it, it does it under the premises and under assumptions of intrinsic equality, moral equality between the members of the community. Of course, this is being violated left and right in many practical cases, but in theory, that's why, as Hobsbawm and others have nicely put it, liberalism and nationalism, at least initially, went hand in hand, right? So they were actually kind of parts of the same, you know, different parts of the same coin. So yes, your intervention was ripe in order for me to actually unpack some of these that may not be as clear to the audience.
Yeah. No, I think it's very interesting, and the whole subject versus citizen idea that you just outlined, it's very to the point, and even to the point of like this liberalism, nationalism. We can discuss it even more in the Q&A. I don't want to take you off your presentation. Just my framing, my listening to you just now that gave those thoughts. So the floor is yours by all means.
So I can continue unless George.
Yes. No, that's fine. I don't see any other questions. So if anybody has any questions,
Okay.
Be more than happy to. And you can send questions even during the discussion on the chat, and we'll make sure that we address them. So thank you.
Okay, so let me continue now. I mean, it was a nice break for us. So now I want to move to the next part of the talk, where I'm going to provide you with my understanding of how nationalism spread. There are many different theories, if those of you who have studied nationalism will know. There are many different proposed paths, but here I'm going to propose not a path of how nationalism emerged, because in my view, nationalism as every other ideological movement emerges primarily through these people who come up with it, right? So in a way, nationalism, in my view, is a product of the Enlightenment, and it's a product of people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the Constitution of Poland and Herder and the German Romantics. So I'm not talking about the ideas and the reason I'm not talking about the ideas is because there are many ideas at any given point. As you know, you can go online today and find many people arguing for many isms and many type of ways of structuring society, but some stick and some are adopted by individual leaders and others are not. So the question that the most pressing answers that is most pressing to answer has to do with why nationalism was adopted and spread rather than why it came about. Because in a way, there is at any given point there is a number of ideas that could be adopted. The question is, why are those adopted and spread? In my view, in other words, to put it in I guess millennial or new generation parlance, why it became viral, right? So why does nationalism become viral, adopted and viral? And I think the first part of my book, The Politics of Nation Building, accounts for some of these. And a lot of it could be summarized, ironically, by the cover also of my book with Scott Radnitz that was done by George Kondos. And this cover depicts, as you can see, a very Machiavellian view over the world. And the idea here is that in modernity, some leaders started playing this game you see here, which is purposely not fully chess. It's more complex. It's them trying to go to another territory, nearby territory, and try to meddle with the identity characterization or the self-identifying features, let's say, of a community of people living usually in the border areas or what we call peripheral areas of a country, and try to either sell them that they're the same, so try to play a kinship card, or just if they have grievances with a core group, let's say, as I call it, of the country they reside in, to tell them that they could be better off either by being independent or by being a part of their country. And that starts being played out very intensely, I claim, right around the Napoleonic Wars. It's not that this is the first time that this process of what I call fifth column politics unpacks itself. Obviously, there is a lot of that happening with the Reformation, Counter-Reformation movements. And even in ancient times, you can find a lot of this, right? The Spartans and the Athenians and the role of Alcibiades and so on and so forth. But it really becomes a very common strategy of undermining your opponent along national or ethnic lines in the early 19th century onwards. So the reason I focus on that period is because before that period, although this process is happening, it's not happening along ethnic or national lines, right? So this confluence, this interaction of this practice of fifth column politics, which is ancient in practice, and the content or the cleavage dimension around which this is happening, which is ethnic rather than partisan, as it was in Athens versus Sparta, or religious, as it was in the Reformation, Counter-Reformation period, it suddenly becomes along the lines of, you are Poles, so there should be a Poland, rather than you being ruled by this evil empire. So you should side with me, Napoleon, to get your independence with my help. And in this process, you can help my extending my empire, right? So this idea of an externally backed group and how this plays out in interstate relations, of course, and how the revisionist, whether the elites of the country you live in are revisionist or not, led me to my theory of nation building, which was not focused so much on the spread of nationalism, which I just explained to you how I see the spread of it happening, but also how different groups then fared in the hands of their governments. So before I pivot to that part, I want everybody to understand the first kind of mechanism. So the mechanism, again, just to summarize it, is that once the logic of externally backed groups kicks in, and the leader of a country that observes that externally backed group realizes that that group is being backed by their enemy power, that automatically brings to the mind of the leader or the leaders that are deciding how to deal with their population, that, yeah, nation building seems to be the right thing to do. Nationalism seems to be a good way to inoculate our population against this type of attacks in the future from outside. So this incentive structure that has to do with the idea that every ruler doesn't want to lose territory for a variety of reasons that you can think of, even from purely political economy point of view. I don't want to lose, land, because that's where I get my grain from, or that's where I get, my taxes from, or what have you. Even from that mundane level, even if they don't have any nationalist ideas in the beginning, these leaders who were usually monarchs, or they were usually using coercive means to rule over their populations, suddenly they start thinking, oh, you know what, this idea of nationalism that I hear being important, and the social contract and what have you, may be a good way to inoculate my population, to indoctrinate, if you want, my population through schooling and other policies, in order, as we argue here in this article with Keith Darden, in order to avoid or to protect ourselves from threats to our territorial integrity. So based on this argument that I developed in the first part of the Politics of Nation Building, we teamed up with Professor Darden, who is a professor at American University, to try to explain why some leaders pursue nation building in some parts of the world early on, while others don't pursue nation building and actually pursue other types of policies, and how that plays out in terms of linguistic, for example, heterogeneity around the world. Because as you can imagine, countries that had incentives, and that's what we argue in this article, countries that had early on, that experienced early on this type of incentive structure that I just explained, an outside power coming and trying to meddle with your populations in your borders, that automatically gave the incentive at the metropole, right, at the capital, let's say, of that state, to start thinking about the identity of those people living in the peripheries. And as soon as that started happening, then you had incentives to do what I call nation building, right? You had incentives to propagate a particular, I define nation building as the effort of a government to propagate a particular national narrative in the country over any other narrative. So once you do that strongly enough and meticulously enough, and as Keith Darden argues in his own work, if you do that through schools in a very systematic and very committed way, what happens, according to Darden, is this first mover advantage, what he calls a first mover advantage, which means the first organization to inoculate a population with this type of treatment, nationalist narrative, will have the consciousness, let's say, or will control the hearts and minds of a population for a good period, if not forever. He would argue for a long, long time. I'm not 100% sure how long it lasts, but it is quite durable. I agree with him that it's durable. And the main mechanism that this durability is being preserved, is through what he calls gatekeeping, or what we call in this article gatekeeping. It means that the first generation gets this treatment and then they become parents. And then even that schooling, if that schooling goes away, the parents are going to keep on saying the same stories to their children for a long time. So let me recap what we've said so far, because I know I'm doing a fast track kind of argument here. First, I've argued through my work that because we live in an anarchic world, because there is no world government, in other words, countries have to often fight with each other for their territorial integrity and for their boundaries. That has been happening for centuries. At some point in time, I have argued, leaders of certain states have started using a particular type of policies to undermine their hostile neighbors, let's say, or their rivals. These policies included the cultivation of particular type of characteristics, linguistic differences, ethnic differences, tapping into this type of grievances and differences that may have existed in order to aggravate the population against their government, against their capital, and then they would either come in and liberate these people or help them get self-determination as a way to undermine their rival. When leaders in the capitals where those groups were residing in realized that this was the game that was being played, the geopolitical game, I mean, not any other game, that was being played, they pursued what I call nation building. And this is where Darden's work becomes relevant. When that whole process unraveled, Darden suggests that the governments that went and did compulsory schooling, mass schooling with national content and did it meticulously and systematically, they ended up creating durable loyalties. They ended up standardizing the languages. They ended up reducing heterogeneity in society, thus making it harder for the external actors to play that, game against them. And ultimately, this led to more homogeneous nation states in the cases where that happened. Obviously, you can now understand that the other part of our argument unfolds in a different way. Countries that didn't have this type of incentives didn't pursue nation building. And there are dozens of states in the world that haven't pursued this type of nation building. And we argue that these type of places, in this article, we argue that these type of places are places where either guarantor power was basically guaranteeing the borders of that community or that state, or in a way, the place was not contested in its borders at all because maybe people didn't think it had natural resources or enough. It wasn't valuable enough to fight and kill and die for it, right? So just to give you an example so that this is not just purely theoretical, think of, for example, a lot of parts of what we call the Middle East today that were separated between the French and the British during the infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement. A lot of these areas that fratricidal civil wars broke out recently, including in Syria and other places. A lot of the places where ISIS was operating were places that for the longest time, right around the time when nationalism was about to kick in as a dominant ideology, these empire empires basically came right after World War I and put a lead on a lot of these developments and dealt with borders and dealt with state building and nation formation in their own way. Look at Lebanon, look at many cases where the influence of external powers like France or the United Kingdom kind of over-determined the development of state building and so on and so forth in those countries. So in those countries, we don't have the processes that I just developed because the elites didn't have the same incentive structure. The post, let's say, colonial elites don't have the same incentive structure that other elites had in other parts of the world that had to play this game. Now, that doesn't mean, and that brings me to the next part of the last part of my talk in a way, because I know we want to have a Q&A, a lively Q&A here. That brings me to the last part, because my argument with Darden, but also my argument on my own, in my own book, point to what has happened so far, but it doesn't say anything about the future. And that's where I want to focus a little bit on the future, because I know you may be wondering, why should I care about all this, right? Why should I care about what happened in the 19th century or early 20th century with empires and so on and so forth? And by the way, today, we're all, living in a world that is more global and so on and so forth. Well, you should care because, as I've already alluded to, there are many parts of the world that haven't been nation built, which means that the more these colonial or post-colonial arrangements are being broken down, and I'm all for both decolonization and the vestiges of colonialism being undone, but in that process, a lot of let's say, for lack of a better term, unfinished business at the local ground. We see those grievances simmering again in certain areas where they haven't been dealt with. They haven't been let's say, either dealt with through consociationalism or other arrangements. And a lot of leaders start playing similar games to the ones I talked about, stoking ethnic tensions, trying to get the control of the capital and disadvantage other groups and so on and so forth, which means that we may see a lot more nation building in the future, right? Similarly, this globalization that we've been experiencing for a long time now, with both its benefits and its ills, like global inequality rising, as we know, has also come with developments that I'm part of myself. I carry two nationalities. I'm both Greek and American. And the number of people in the world that are in that category of carrying 1, 2, 3, even sometimes nationalities is exponentially increasing every day. Now, that's all good and fine during times of peace. But as we know from the past, in times of war or geopolitical turmoil, easily these things can turn national or ethnic, if you want. And we unfortunately all know what happened with the Japanese Americans in World War II and the internment camps. And we all know how easily groups can overnight be turned into potential fifth columns through the discourse, the deleterious discourse of elites that are thinking they can benefit from something like that, right? So that's another way that we can start seeing this nation-building geopolitical dynamics unfolding. Moreover, as I alluded to, inequalities, global economic inequalities, are obviously increasing migration flows, but also climate change, maybe not so talked about in this respect. It's talked about more generally, but it in and of itself is creating migration. A lot of climate migration is happening, and more will be happening in the future, which means what? It means that societies that we've been thinking of even as nation-built and homogeneous from a nation-state perspective are no longer going to be able to live off this equilibrium they have generated in the past. They will need to find new ways to conceptualize themselves and new ways to nation build to accommodate these new populations that have come to their shores, metaphorically speaking, even if they're landlocked, and to integrate them or find a way of enmeshing, or however they're going to find imaginative ways to move forward as a society. So this brings me to a lot of these dynamics that I just discussed are being fought over and are creating a lot of tensions that we try to capture in various chapters in this edited volume called Enemies Within, that have to do with this friction that is happening between politicians who are trying to situate themselves into creating minimum winning coalitions, right? Trying to get in control of power. And in the process of doing that, they may start talking down or claiming that some immigrant group or some refugee group is undermining national security, or some scapegoating a particular group because of the religious background or the racial background that makes them particularly pernicious in their minds or likely to side with an external power. And this is a very dangerous but very present dynamic in today's politics that we need to be vigilant about and careful, because we need to understand that a lot of times this is happening exactly because these politicians are trying to create these minimum winning coalitions at the local level. So that's a dynamic that we're observing, that as nationalism and nation building are becoming resurgent because of these other reasons, at the same time at the domestic level. And that's another way to justify Petros's and his collaborators' title, as I said. There is a lot of resurgent nationalism at the domestic level that is spurred from these type of dynamics that, you know, we argue with Scott in this volume, have a lot to do with domestic incentives about coalition building and getting power at the local level, and less so at the international level. So nationalism is in a way resurgent both internationally, but also domestically. And to an extent that needs to make us start thinking about what's the role of ideas today and the diffusion of ideas in the 21st century. And I'll close with some of these thoughts before I go to policy implications. The diffusion of ideas for the longest time, I know Petros and others may be remembering that, had to do with how beneficial the diffusion of ideas was, because we were talking, especially in the 1990s, about and the 80s, the diffusion of ideas of democracy, movements against authoritarian regimes, how the whole collapse of the Soviet Union happened through leaders of various countries learning from democratic movements from other countries, the solidarity movements and so on and so forth in Poland. And that was how we understood the diffusion of ideas. But as anyone can, sense when they're looking around, there's a lot of learning happening today, but a lot of this learning can also happen amongst leaders who don't want to spread what we would consider benevolent or good ideas. A lot of these ideas have been spreading amongst authoritarian forces. How can we best surveil our population? How can we best put down individuals? How can we make sure there's an equilibrium that benefits the few on top in authoritarian regimes or wannabe authoritarian regimes? And that's something else we need to be vigilant about, which dovetails well with my point about scapegoating and fifth column politics. So what can we do? Because I've said some good things and bad things about nationalism. I've said it has been a force for good and it has been a force for bad. I've talked about how nation building has taken place in some places, but hasn't taken place in others. I've talked about also why you should care about nation building, because we'll see a lot more. How can we limit nation building into more benevolent policies, like just trying to create a common solidarity, as we were talking about with Petros earlier, rather than taking the form of exclusionary policies like ethnic cleansing or deportation or killings or segregation like South Africa did during apartheid, right? So what can we do to reduce the violent aspects that nationalism and nation building can take, and to increase the more ideational or less violent and even accommodationist or multiculturalist arrangements that some of you may be more in favor? First of all, in my work in the politics of nation building, I found that the safest way to do all these things that I just suggested is to foster interstate alliances. The more allied states there are in the world, the more European unions there are in the world, the more African unions there are in the world, the more ASEANs there are in the world, the more regional cooperation we get, the better it is for nation building. Why? Because as you remember from just 30 minutes ago, the more alliances we have, the less likely different countries are going to be playing this game with each other. If I'm benefiting a lot as a country from trade with your country, I may be a lot less likely to start playing this game of instigating or agitating some group in your borders against you, right? So the more alliances, the less of this, the less need for any type of nation building policy. You can go with supranational type of arrangements like the European Union. Second point, and how timely this point is with what we're seeing in Crimea and in the rest of Eastern Ukraine right now, uphold the principle of territorial integrity. I promise I wrote this a long time before. It wasn't just to fit the news. I strongly believe that more often than not, with very few exceptions, I've written about this as far back as the Russian-Georgian War in 2008, we should uphold the principle of territorial integrity. And although there are some extreme cases where we should allow for border changes, we should be adamant at upholding this principle. Why? Because the moment you don't uphold this principle, the moment the international system is perceived as being weak in that respect, that sends a signal to these aspiring autocrats, to these aspiring irredentist leaders, that they can do whatever they want, that they can change those borders without any consequence. And then that, of course, also emboldens local level secessionists or leaders who want to undermine the territorial integrity of certain countries. And in confluence, jointly, these can really be terribly potent forces to change territorial boundaries. And what happens then? We know from statistical analysis in political science that that's when we get the most likelihood to get ethnic cleansings. That's where we get genocide. That's when we get mayhem. So with the exception of very, very, very specific cases, more often than not, the canon should be to uphold the principle of territorial integrity. Now, one of these extreme cases is what we call the responsibility to protect, that you probably have heard in your classes. And my caveat here is, yes, we do have a responsibility to protect groups that are about to be targeted with ethnic cleansing or genocide. But if we, and when I say we, I mean the international community or your favorite great power in the world, when you're about to do that as a great power or as a coalition of powers, you should be fully committed to the cause and act fast and decisively. Because as my theory shows, if you don't do that, then basically you're going to observe an ethnic cleansing, a reaction that is going to be really violent from the country of residence. Finally, and perhaps counterintuitively from the perspective of international relations and nationalism studies, improving relations between countries is the main way to improve relations between core and non-core groups. So to improve relations within a country, between groups within a country, we must improve relations between countries. And that's kind of echoing, again, what I said in the first bullet point here. So I leave you with those thoughts, and I'm happy to open up for a Q&A.
Wow. As promised, quite a impactful presentation, taking us through some of the things that we sort of like framing the theory, and then like bringing us with a lot of food for thought. And I like the last part as far as like the not just discussing it or what has happened in the past, but giving us those bullet points of like to the point kind of argumentation. Of course, I have many comments, but I see there are a couple of questions in the Q&A. But
Should I
before
ask the students to say them?
turn, I will, yeah. So what I can do is I can, opt that and give them the ability to make their voice
Isaac has a
seen.
question. Yeah.
Yeah, and but before I do that, I'm going to actually turn the table over to Mr. Danis, who who's, has helped us out throughout, and it was, I think, with my glitch of not bringing him on. So if he's willing to be seen right now, that would be great if he can do it. So I'm going to try to unmute him. Mr. Danis, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can't see you.
I took off the but I guess doesn't somehow in any case you better not to see me, as Kolokotronis will say during his period. Καλύτερα να μας ακούνε παρά να μας βλέπουνε.
Maybe have in front of your camera, do you have like a sticker or something?
I do, but somehow it doesn't seem to be work. I'm unmuting her, but the camera doesn't seem to do its job. Now, having said that, I guess, I know what it is. Let me give me a minute. The technology has been very helpful, but you have to.
Now we see something.
You have to keep up with it. How's that?
Excellent.
Perfect.
Pleasure to see you.
Okay, that's good. So only because I have two computers, they tell me if I have two computers, I'll be better off. In any case, thank you very much, Professor Milonas. The name sounds very familiar. I have a cousin in Karistos, which is also Milonas. He's an engineer. Delighted to hear all your information and things. But first and most important, I want to thank Professor Vavakas, the director of the Institute of Eastern Mediterranean Studies, which he's working diligently and very hard to promote democracy and citizenship, as I'm very both committed and very interested in the process, and because the only way really to waking up some of the leaders is the participation of the citizens, all the citizens in some ways, not only the elites and the educated, but the masses, that it's so important that they only participate when the process is ready to blow up. It is a great pleasure to welcome all of you, and I'm working with Professor Marcas, which has been very dedicated to this process, and I'm looking forward to the whole week of this seminar. And of course, he's been working and he's been able to get professors, people, experts from all the continents, and it's going to be a beautiful week. And the political tectonic plates have been in such a movements and such a problems that the only way is going to be perhaps full participation of our citizens, or we're going to have a difficult time to unravel or to stop the upcoming global earthquake in in every level. And of course, the most important part is that the nationalism and the revisionists, especially the Russia, the Ukraine, and of course, every problem, from my experience, has a root causes. And it's hard to take and solve the problem without really identify the root causes historically in some ways and trying to modify that and trying to bring it back to the process. Of course, we have Greece in the Balkans. There is another situation that has been brewing for many years, and of course, and this earthquake in Turkey, it shows how vulnerable we are from a catastrophic catastrophic events that it's very difficult. One of the things I have put some questions and some thoughts in your last few processes, few bullet points. The part that is interesting, and I do believe that, like the United States, like the Soviet, I mean and obviously the European Union, but also the Soviet Union before that, even though you have the unions and the regional get together and create an institution, whether it is a union, whether it is an association, whether it is whatever it is, then at the same time, the fear of that results could affect the other regions, as we see right now. China is parting, or at least is talked about, is going to support the Soviet Union in a little war with Ukraine. So then the next thing could very well be the European Union and with the United States could really respond in kind, and we have a world catastrophe. So it goes back to my own personal theory, and I've been trying and without obviously the forum as well as the ability, is to look at individual citizenship and forming that kind of a needs of survival and success, because at the end of the day, everybody is looking for that point of survival and success for themselves, the family, and so forth. One of the other parts, which is very important, enemies within enemies within a country, a region, and so forth. Right now, you have Macron is debating whether they should make sure that Russia doesn't dissolve itself, and so forth. And the rest of the members of the European Union have a different thought, and they want to totally dissolve the Russians and change of regimes. And so these problems, but the within part is interesting. And I relate that to two things. One is this January 6th capital invasion or capital attack. Then I also go back to 4 years earlier, approximately, it was 4 years earlier, when the Speaker of the House of Representatives, representing 350, at least the Speaker of 350 million Americans, okay, rips the speech of the president in front of 80 to 100 million viewers. I'm not a political sighted in any way, shape, or form. I always I feel a citizen rather than a party member, and so it's a very fine line. How do we really deal with those two areas? You have a public wrongly attacking the Capitol, and you have a representative, a Speaker of the House of Representatives, ripping the speech of the president, disliking him and his policies, and I understand, but representing the rest of the American people, doing the same thing and presenting this to the American viewers in some ways of condemnation before the process starts of the previous election. And I like some at least some kind of a understanding as a simple citizen.
Thank you, Mr. Danis, and thank you for your support. And I'll yield the floor to Harry and his response.
There is actually there's a lot in what you ask, so I'm going to try to do justice. So to begin with, I take your point about the different blocks. If I understood it correctly, the different blocks can end up operating like different states. You're right. So once you do this aggregate that I'm talking about to the European Union or ASEAN, then one could say, well, then we may have the problem that these groups are going to start fighting with each other as states did at the local level. That is a possibility. That is a possibility. It's not necessary, right? Because these groups, these blocks could have economic relations. As we know, ASEAN and the European Union do have economic relations too. So you could see, and by the way, these are not just my thoughts. Montesquieu, right, has said that since the spirit of the laws, the whole argument was that commerce and trade is going to be what's going to solve the problems in the end, right? So maybe allow me to be optimistic that maybe, this idea of economic reasons, right, that could actually somehow down the road help us tame these things that I'm talking about. But definitely within the blocks, I think I take it from your point that you agree that within the blocks, the desecuritization is happening. The question is whether the blocks are going to go to war with each other or something like that. I totally agree with you on that.
If I may quickly, I am totally in agreement, or I believe that this will be very much the process, including the Middle East especially, that you have so many actors that if they had a common process, common needs and policies, would be wonderful to be together. And I'm not opposing it, just bring it to bring it to our attention that could also be
Totally agree. So, but now I'm going to pivot to your point about the Soviet Union, for example. So you're actually giving me a good opportunity to clarify something before we go to the two questions from the Q&A. The Soviet, any of these unions, I don't want to sound too optimistic, any of these unions could break up any day. Right, the Soviet Union collapsed. The European Union could disintegrate. I mean, wearing my Greek hat, we were part of this discussion quite a bit whether the Grexit or the Brexit would have led to the demise or disintegration of the European Union. So these discussions are constantly alive, and for good reason, and help us kind of rethink why we have these things. So once that happens, unfortunately, my pessimistic prediction, if that happens, as it did in the Soviet Union, we saw what happened in the Soviet Union. A lot of the things we're observing since the collapse of the Soviet Union are related to my fears that once you have that, you will start having again the game that I was talking about, right? And we did have it in Georgia and in Estonia, and then so those are, unfortunately, those are not things that once you solve them once, then they go away. So I agree with you. So I think we're in agreement on that. And I think you understood what I'm arguing. And I think that's actually a good sign that I managed to convey it in such a short time. It usually takes a lot longer. But to go to your last point, which actually I have been I could have skipped it because it's too contemporary, but I think it's too important to skip it. I've actually been so worried about the United States since I've only become a citizen in the United States in last year, although I've been here for 21 years, 22 now. So I have been worried about the polarization, about the extreme views, the fact that people are not listening to each other, that it's really hard to have a friend from the other party anymore, and so on and so forth. Those are deleterious things for a society, any society, and definitely for the US as well. And the discourse of enemies within, as you picked it up, is very much present here. And we have a chapter actually on this as well. But more importantly, from my perspective, because I didn't write that chapter, but what I have to say about this is my effort has been to try to tackle this through creating a new podcast that I've put in the chat. It's called American Constitutive Stories. I just started it. And I'm interviewing people from very different backgrounds, as you said, Mr. Danis, that basically we're trying to both get the generation that is listening maybe to us from, the younger group and the older people. So my first interviewee was someone who was in the Johnson administration in the 1960s. And my last one, my second one was someone who definitely wasn't born then, and was born in the late 1990s, if not early 2000s, no, late 1990s. So we're trying to, both generationally, but also in terms of their approaches, capture different people, primarily not to expose how differently we think about that, and we are thinking very differently about that, but primarily because my fear is that if we don't find a connective tissue, if we don't find a lowest even common denominator of what it means for us to be all Americans, that's going to be impossible for us to move forward as a country. And I think that really dovetails well with Mr. Garcevich's question, Vesco's Garcevich's question. And I don't know if he wants to raise it, because I think that that answer I'm going to give is to the heart of his question. So if he wants to,
I think we can have Vesco. Maybe we can even see Vesco if that's okay with him.
Mm-hmm. That would be great.
So Vesco, I don't know if you can. Vesco, can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I'm not able to start video. That's something is going on with my
Okay.
I don't know why it is so. I think that you have to do something.
That's
go ahead. Can you do it now? Let's see. Can we see
the same stuff?
No,
the same stuff.
You should be able to, I should be able to see you, your co-host.
Yeah, we see. Oh, it almost worked.
There you go. I think you're coming.
I think now we are here.
Now our screen is beautiful.
How is doing? Thank you for letting me be for a moment co-panelist or whatever. But I just wanted to tell you how much I enjoyed your presentation, because I'm a practitioner, but let's say as an amateur, so I really carefully follow and read about state building. This is the topic which fascinates me since I, as you know well, grew up and was living in one country, and then I witnessed that country cramming down in the front of my eyes, which actually provoked my intellectual curiosity about state building and state you're ruining, if I can say so. So then you saw my question. I don't want to repeat the question. I just wanted to ask whether your concept is mostly focused on ethnic state building concept, since Smith pointed out that we can, at least from the theoretical point of view, make difference between civic and ethnic nation states, like including state that I'm living now, US or Canada, or in Europe, maybe Switzerland or to some extent Belgium, cannot be described as a nation state like a narrow point of view. This is just what I wanted from you to hear.
Thank you so much. And I'm honored that you joined the call, given your prestigious background in actual politics. So you, if I understand correctly, you're from Montenegro, right? So
yeah,
right. Although Yugoslavia was a big example of what I'm describing, actually. So
yeah.
Tito is Yugoslavia can give you your own answers. You don't need to look elsewhere. In the sense that. And Mr. Danis's question fits with this. We could have not talking about the Soviet Union. We could have talked just about socialist Yugoslavia or Tito's Yugoslavia. And similarly, you can see that as one of my attempts that I said foster, right, interstate relations, good interstate relations, or regional integration schemes. In a way, Yugoslavia, from its very inception, as you know better than me, from 1918, is, at least initially, by the people who put it together, an attempt to create almost like a supranationalist, right, a regional integration scheme, because there is no doubt that the Croats and the Slovenians and the Serbs had a sense of peoplehood, right, and the Montenegrins to an extent, that then created a kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, and some other nationalities, as a way to go beyond those distinctions and create something new that then was called Yugoslavia. So the point is, what I'm trying to say is that for a period, Tito, as you well know, believed that an idea of a Yugoslav nation, of Yugoslav people, could be something that could become the national identity of that group, right? We agree on that. Now, as we know, that didn't pan out because, as Mr. Danis suggested, things sometimes work and sometimes don't, and for a variety of reasons, right? But if we do a hypothetical thought experiment, and let's say Tito could live for 200 years, and he could lead the Yugoslavia for 200 years, maybe in 200 years, what was a 10% of people who said I'm Yugoslav in the census, maybe by year 210, it would be 80% of people living in Yugoslavia who would said I'm a Yugoslav, right? I mean, it's possible. It's not impossible. You agree with me. So that's kind of how I explain to my students how regional integration schemes. Think about some of us here are from European Union, right? How many Greeks, when Greece entered the European Union in the early 1980s or late 1970s, really early 1980s, how many people really felt European? Everybody who spoke about European Union in Greece, which was then the European communities, they would say the Europeans separating themselves from them, right? I mean, you remember that. And I'm sure the same happened with Cypriots, the same happened with it. Now, lately, more and more Greeks, when they say Europe, they mean themselves too. Ironically, although despite the fact that the word Europe is Greek and the woman who has given the name is from Greek history, Greeks did not feel European even after they were members, right? So that's not very different from some Serbs who didn't feel Yugoslav, some Croats who didn't feel Yugoslav, and so on and so forth, right? So what I'm trying to say is that these regional integration identity projects could operate in the long run, could have been successful. And I think the American example is one of them, going back to Mr. Danis's question. The US has been super successful over time in integrating a lot of people into a new identity. And now you don't find descendants of Norwegian immigrants from the 19th century saying, I'm Norwegian or I'm Swedish. They proudly say I'm American, right? So, and that doesn't go only with the Norwegians. And slowly, many second, third, fourth generation Greeks, not to mention even earlier, some Greek Americans, would first and foremost identify as American. So there is, to answer your question more specifically now, there are some countries that, and that's actually something I address head on in my latest book that is forthcoming with Maya Tudor, where we actually say, look, some countries have constitutive stories, understandings of nationhood, that are very much based on ethnic attributes. And those are suffering in their efforts to expand their definition of how you become, right, a member of the nation. And some of them do better than others. And then there are some states that manage to have a tradition like the United States is lucky to have, right? A tradition of the creedal definition of the United States, which means that they do have the Declaration of Independence where they can point back to and say, look, these are the bare minimum things that somebody can believe in order to be an American. Of course, there are some people who want to bring in more things like Christianity or race issues, but there is that other alternative. There are some countries that don't have those alternatives. They don't have these possibilities of imagining themselves differently, which you call civic, or Hans Kohn called civic, and Brubaker and others, and Anthony Smith. But basically, the short answer to your question is yes, some countries have that and others don't, right? But that doesn't mean that the countries that were defined basically on ethnic grounds cannot change. And I'll give you a very personal example. Look at Greece. Suddenly, 70% of Greeks think you can become a Greek. You don't have to be born a Greek. That was unthinkable in the 1990s when I was in university in Greece. Suddenly, Adetokounmpo, single-handedly, right, a very successful player in the NBA, someone who is, rightfully respected and admired for his rise to stardom, has made a lot of Greeks of many generations, not just the youth, to believe that you can be a Greek. They want him to be Greek. They understand him as Greek. They accept him as a Greek, even though that was unthinkable in the 1980s or 1990s Greece that I grew up in, right? So I can give you the example of Germany that changed its law, as you know, recently, to allow for people to be naturalized into being Germans. I mean, we're talking about a country where that was unthinkable again, right? You have to have German blood. And suddenly now you can be naturalized German and even become a minister without being of German blood, right? That's not, that shows that these things can change, but it takes a lot of time to change them. Some cases you fail, right? The Serbian nationalism resurrection in the 1980s onwards was a case where Tito failed to achieve his vision, but it could have worked if it lasted longer. I see you sent me some things. So I'll definitely, maybe I have already actually read this, to be honest, but yeah.
Yeah. Yes, we're really coming up against the clock, but I think it's it's indicative of how rich the topic is and how well grounded our speaker is in this, and we could have him here for a long time. But I do want to there's one more question. I'm not gonna shut anybody off, and I just want to couch and give Isaac the last question. But to that last point and the points that were made by both Mr. Danis and Vesco, how does that play out in the Eastern Mediterranean kind of a thing, and then Isaac, the floor is yours with a brief question.
Yeah, so you're implying Turkey, I think here.
I'm implying, anywhere like from Tunisia to Turkey, this region where it's like this sort of like there is this, or even like the Arab awakening, spring, winter, fall, whatever you want to call it. It just seems to me like a needing of this proto-nationalist or nationalist structuring. Like it's almost like a time zone of studying the entire place of nationalism at different types of different levels of development, kind of a thing,
I believe I'm pretty sure Elizabeth Prodromou, who is going to speak to you next, is going to cover some of that, but I don't want to steal any thunder there. But from my framework, and maybe this is not a very popular thing to say these days, but I've been saying it since 1996 when I was in student politics in Greece. A European Turkey is the Turkey I want and I would like, right? And that's a very consistent message from my theory as well. I just so happened to end up writing something that ended up agreeing with my young self. Meaning, if you think of my theory and if you think of the back and forth I had with Mr. Danis, obviously, as a neighboring country, a lot of the neighboring countries of Turkey would benefit from Turkey being part of supranational kind of Yugoslavia type of or European Union type of arrangement, so that what would this do? It would desecuritize a lot of these issues. It would desecuritize, most importantly, from a Greek perspective, the Muslim minority of Western Thrace, or how the Turkish side would talk about it, and it would desecuritize a lot of issues potentially with Cyprus, and maybe even allow for a solution in the Cyprus issue. Obviously, this is not where we are. We are in the exact opposite area, where Erdogan's Turkey is moving into a direction where it claims that it doesn't need the European Union. It claims that it can be a pole in itself in the international system. This is not the good scenario of my book. This is a scenario where you get a lot of the things you get in Syria, a lot of the meddling you get in the neighborhood, securitization of previously desecuritized situations, and that involves Bulgaria and Greece and other areas. Similarly, I think that fits a little bit with Isaac's questions, so I think I would like to have him ask them so that I can actually the same mix. Yeah.
Hello, Haris. It's nice to have you on.
Good to meet you.
Likewise. So to restate my question, if I may, you made a reference toward the later part of your presentation that you think that unions, the EU, the African Union, etc., which promote greater levels of interaction among states, reduce the odds of resurgent nationalism. And I wonder, how do you defend that position against people who point to nationalist parties from West Europe to the border with Russia that have risen over the past few years? And also, do you see North Atlantic security for the Ukrainian cause as being a sort of a, if you will, a reducing factor in instances of nationalism in Europe?
Yeah, so I mean, the second one is a very heated debate. It has to do, because it's kind of hard to answer this in the abstract, right? There is something going on right now. It's a war, right? So there's an invasion that we're dealing with. So I'm gonna, and I need to start with a caveat. Everything I said is from the perspective, and you will realize how obvious this is, but it's important to be said. All of the things we do in political science are probabilistic, right? So our point is, more often than not, we predict this, right? So even the most potent theories we have explain 80% of the time correctly, or 85%. There's never 100%. We're not hard sciences. I'm not throwing an apple and always falls down. I'm not Newton, right? So we're just dealing with a different type of animal in social sciences, right? So that's first thing to make this clear. The second way to answer your first question first, I would say that I mentioned developments that are both at the international and the domestic level, and I never said that these work in tandem, right? So you may have less interstate nationalism occurrences, as you don't have Hungary and Romania are not going to go to war tomorrow. And I think part of the reason they're not going to go to war is because of the European Union. Not, in a very linear way, but there is a process, there is a whole bunch of reasons why, right? But they are related to this regional integration scheme. They're related to the delegitimation of certain things and so forth, and desecuritization of some of their relationships. Slovenia and Croatia are not going to go to war over their border disputes, and they didn't. They could have, but they didn't. And I think that's part of the Europeanization and so on. So I can go on with a lot of it. Greece and North Macedonia did not go to war, and they solved these things because of the European Union process to a great extent. Not because, because of the process, not so much being members, both of them, as you know, but the aspiration and the possibility being there. So that's what my theory, again, probabilistically, maybe I'm predicting correctly, 20 out of the 25 cases, I'm happy with that. It's social sciences. That's one way to answer this. Now, the domestic trends could be operating in Hungary, as you said, or in Italy. At the same time, we don't have interstate war between Italy and Switzerland, or Italy, or actually Switzerland is not a good example since it's not a member state, but Italy over Fiume or whatever. Although you don't have this interstate, you may still get Meloni running Italy. You may still get Orban running Hungary, right? And why is that? Because, as I said, there are other processes like globalization, global inequalities exacerbated through globalization, social media, the diffusion of successful practices, meaning campaigning practices of other leaders and messages they used that then they diffused, like, Nigel Farage was not the first person to make nationalist arguments. And Steve Bannon had really close relationship with this person, and so on and so forth. So these networks, this diffusion of ideas I talked about, can happen at the domestic level without upsetting the international architecture, but upsetting domestic level politics and turning them more or less nationalistic, if you want, or narrow nationalistic. That goes back actually to Mr. Garcevitz's question, Vesko Grasevitz, when he talked about ethnic versus civic. You can even think about these debates about moving a definition more to the ethnic rather than the civic pendulum, right? So that's what you're observing, right? I think your question, you're observing that there is a lot of movement, but the argument that is talking about geopolitical game does not necessarily explain the domestic game, right? The domestic politics game. My volume on the 5th columns is more attuned to that. My Politics of Nation Building book is more geopolitical. So that's how I would categorize this. To go to your $1 million question, and not to restrict everybody's break time, I guess that's the last.
We just need to wrap it up.
Yeah. So I won't be giving you a satisfactory maybe answer because it's so context specific, but there are many points in time where my predictions would have been different, right? So if Russia was, just to give you hypotheticals, if Russia had become a member of NATO, we wouldn't be talking about any of that, and that would be consistent with my theory, right? And that is an argument that has been made, that at certain points in time, it was possible that Russia could have moved closer to NATO, and that's not something I'm making up. Even Bill Clinton has talked about it and others. If Ukraine was a member of NATO, again, without Russia, again, we wouldn't have had that, right? And so there are many counterfactuals that would fit with my story. What's going on now doesn't have to be predicted by my story directly, right? And we don't have enough time to play it out enough, but I think you get the gist of my answer. Yeah.
Yes. Well, like you said, I mean, we could be talking about this for a long time, and I couldn't be more grateful to Professor Milonas for a terrific presentation, very thought-provoking, and I'm sure you leave us with a lot of questions moving forward.
Thankfully, Pedro, you have such a wonderful lineup. I'm honored to be the first one, but you have such a wonderful lineup that a lot of your questions will be answered, Isaac and others, in other sessions, thankfully.
No, thank you. And I think that it's not just I think, but the questions that go unanswered are the good ones, because they sort of like ferment conversation and discussion moving forward. And I thank everybody